I find irony is a blade that cuts he who wields it most especially.
You're not a lot of fun, are you?
Hey, welcome back to ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy. Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves is a big hit with fans of D&D, resonating way more with the fan base than that other D&D movie that we don't gotta talk about. But I think that the reason why this film is so successful with its fan base is because its structure actually emulates a D&D campaign. Not literally with people sitting around a table and rolling dice, but it takes the essence of a campaign and puts it perfectly into a cool, fun narrative film. So in this video, we're going to talk about how the filmmakers managed to take the structure of a D&D campaign and adapt it so well into a film.
They made a movie about that game from Stranger Things?
Yes, but look, D&D is more than a plot device for shows set in the 80s, even if the movie does feature Sophia Lillis. As one of the oldest and most popular fantasy role-playing games, it is by far the most referenced tabletop game in every form of entertainment.
I'm already one of the undead, Greg. I can still throw death spells, huh, Steve?
But you probably wouldn't know that if you had a lot of friends in high school.
You can't sit with us!
What makes this movie work is the story. The disjointed aspects of the adventure, the heavy use of bonafide lore, and subtle meta references allow the film to play out just like a typical D&D campaign. And despite the fact that we never see the larger game being played, it's relatively easy for longtime players to catch on. Some characters make distinct choices that seem to be of their own free will,
I'm a planner. I make plans.
while others are simply playing a role and are even robotic at times. The player characters form a pretty standard party, and they embody the stereotypes of their class.
What do you mean player characters? Are you trying to say they got game?
Kinda. See, player characters in D&D are characters played by the actual people playing the game. It's a way to differentiate them from non-player characters or NPCs who are controlled by the DM.
Kind of like Ryan Reynolds in Free Guy.
Actually, that's a great comparison. High five.
But wait, what's a DM?
Well, DM stands for Dungeon Master, and in D&D, they dictate the story. If the player characters are actors in a play, then the DM is the author, director, set designer, and literally everything else. Most of the time, they simply tell the story like a narrator, but occasionally, they have to assume a role themselves, hence NPCs. These characters are typically villains and side characters, but occasionally they act as guiding characters, like Zinc-Yandar, our paladin friend.
But in the movie, how do you know who's a player character and who is an NPC?
Now that's a great question. While there's nothing directly stating who is an NPC and who's a player character, it's clear that characters like Zenk have all the answers in nearly every circumstance, while Edgun, Holga, Simon, and Doric are the only ones constantly being challenged.
I'll go lost.
The player characters have more natural dialogue,
Holga, I could kiss you!
Try it.
whereas the NPCs all talk like the staff at your local Ren Fair.
Welcome to medieval times. I'll be your serving wench, Melinda.
Plus, with the exception of a few small scenes, there isn't a single moment in the film without at least one of them in it. This also means that there is not a lot of character development for the NPCs, which is probably why characters like Red Wizard Safina come off as generic.
Because in a D&D campaign, you wouldn't focus on the side characters.
Exactly, you're catching on. The player characters in this film are almost cliche representations of their class. We have the strong but dumb barbarian, a sly druid, an inspirationally charismatic bard, and a sorcerer who continues to surprise both himself and the team throughout the whole movie. None of them follow the traditional hero narrative, and they all have elaborate backstories that are spoon-fed to the audience almost immediately after we meet them. They also make choices that don't always neatly fit into the narrative, such as using Jonathan to escape from prison, despite the High Council telling them that they had approved their pardon as they were falling. The DM has an ideal plan for the story, but the players frequently have another. Another prime example is the bridge scene, where Zenk explains the complexity involved with crossing the bridge, just to have the whole thing fall apart with one wrong step.
I may have triggered the mechanism.
It's incredibly common for DMs to overcomplicate a campaign, and when that happens, players have to think of creative solutions to advance, which is exactly what this scene emulates. The player characters also have a sense of randomness to their abilities, as if they're being controlled by a dice roll. When Holga is escaping from Forge's guards, she clearly nat 20'd on her roll while Edgun crit failed.
What's a nat 20?
Nat 20 is a natural 20. In D&D, almost all actions are determined by rolling a 20-sided die. The dice rolls account for luck or fate in any given circumstance.
That's amazing!
So if you wanted to attack, persuade, or simply notice the important details of a room, you have to roll for it. The higher the number, the more likely your character will do whatever you're trying to do. Rolling a 20 in most cases is guaranteed success.
Say it! Say it! Say it!
Look at it! Natural 20!
and doing so typically allows you to pull off nearly impossible feats. Now with that said, characters are also given modifiers, which add a specific number to particular rolls in order to account for their natural abilities. Meaning barbarians like Holga will typically roll well in fights, and bards like Edgin tend to succeed in situations that require charisma. There are plenty of moments that feel like a dice roll. Heck, the intellect devourers passing them on the bridge is literally an intelligence check, even if it is used ironically. In this case, everyone rolled so low that the creatures couldn't even find any intellect to devour, despite Zenk info dumping about the species just seconds before.
Yeah, what was that about? Clearly he was dropping a lot of knowledge. How come they didn't detect him?
Well, for a typical paladin, even an NPC, intelligence is one of their lowest stats. The rest of the party is also made up of classes that don't typically put points into intelligence. Either that or Zenk rolled pretty well, as do the rest of the NPCs in this movie. Safina is able to get literally everything she wants until she's directly confronted by the players, as does Forge for the majority of the movie. Even Holga's detour to her ex's house feels like an interaction between a player and a DM-controlled NPC. The whole conversation plays out like something that the DM didn't want to get distracted with, but a player persisted in pursuing anyways. In D&D, players are encouraged to make their own choices no matter how far off the planned path it goes.
I'm going on an adventure!
But that doesn't mean that the DM can't make every wrong path lead to a dead end, or figure out a creative way to weave it into the story. In this case, that happens to be the walking stick / portal gun.
Smooth jazz will be deployed in 3, 2, 1.
However, the DM can't control everything, so even with these perfect characters in the mix, it also doesn't stop the plan from going off the rails. The MacGuffin changes several times in the film, from getting to Edgin's daughter, to the Tablet of Resurrection, to the helmet, and back to the tablet again, all just to be sporadically used to revive a member of the party. It also explains some of the film's funnier moments, such as the interviews in the graveyard.
4 more questions, right?
Yes.
No, that wasn't for you. Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it.
This scene plays out like a DM being sassy after the players have gone way off the originally planned campaign. The other huge selling point for D&D players is how all the spells, places, races, and motivations are all played book, specifically the big red one. But not only does it respect the lore, but it also gives a special spotlight to some lesser known fan favorites. The gelatinous cube, the mimic, fat dragons, the displacer beasts, owlbears. All of it feels like a treat to those who spent hours fighting them in their own campaigns.
Not a single dog? That's rude.
Right, you'd think that somebody would have a dog. Anyways, we also see tons of races you would typically see in a Neverwinter campaign. While humans make up a majority of the party, half-elves, tieflings, Dragonborn, and Aarakocra races still make appearances as well. What we don't see are some of your more stereotypical D&D races like orcs, dwarves, or dark elves, and that's because Neverwinter has a historically complicated relationship with these particular races, which Doric elaborates on in her introduction. In fact, there was only one orc and one dwarf scene in the whole movie, the orc in the beginning and the dwarf in the maze. And before you come at me in the comments about Bradley Cooper's short-lived appearance, remember, he was either a gnome or a halfling and not a dwarf.
Can we keep the tradition of Bradley Cooper playing short, angry, but also emotionally sensitive characters? Because honestly, I mean, he kills it each time.
I completely agree. High five. And the spells in this film are more than just a CGI trick to make JK jealous. Every spell we see, from the most basic catnip to the most powerful spells, is a small Easter egg for D&D players. Spellcasting in D&D is almost a game within itself, and the film shows off some of the spells, but also creative ways the players can use them. Like everything else in D&D, they require skill checks and dice throws, and even the most experienced magicians can fail them, which explains why Simon's hologram started acting like a character from Five Nights at Freddy's. Simon uses simple spells like Prestigiation and Blur that most starting players have access to. Compare that to Safina, who casts a Time Stop, a 9th level spell that only the most experienced spellcasters can cast. For players that recognize the difference, this makes Safina feel like the final boss, going toe-to-toe with a player that's only completed the first few levels. But despite being massively underleveled, the party is still able to win through a bit of luck and creativity, which is the goal of pretty much every D&D campaign, like ever. Details like this create a meta-narrative in the movie that D&D players can also recognize, which adds a unique element to this film. Even the smaller details, like the fact that almost every planning scene takes place in a tavern, or the inclusion of the original characters from the original D&D cartoon in the labyrinth scene, making it feel like a love letter to longtime players.
Sounds like a lot of fun. Why do you think those initial reviews were so bad?
Well, when you look at the story outside of the D&D lens, it feels like a fantasy comedy similar to Your Highness or Knight's Tale. But instead of leaning into the comedy, it takes itself too seriously at times. I can see why critics were initially critical.
I do not understand.
I do. I understood that reference.
But after it debuted at South by Southwest, its Rotten Tomatoes score shot up. The fans, especially those who have spent their retirement money on new dice, they get it, and they had a totally different reaction, which is great news given that there's been a lot of controversy around Hasbro and how it's using D&D as a property. If the movie continues to be a success with fans, this could be a fantastic avenue to build on the vast lore and cultural influence that D&D has. This could mean more movies or even its own cinematic universe. Only time will tell. But what did you guys think of the movie? Do you want to see more D&D films? Any important details that we missed? Let me know in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.